Hey, I'm gonna try something different here. I wanted to get some new content out, in the time that I have right now. And what I'm gonna be doing is reacting to some photographs I took during the uprisings of last summer. It's totally unscripted, totally unedited. I'm just gonna try to react and explain the stories behind the pictures because I think it's a unique part of our history. And going forward, these are going to be the kind of things that go into textbooks. Not saying that my pictures in particularly will. That would be nice, though. That would be cool. But I feel like I document some things that were worth seeing, and I just wanted to kind of react to them. I am the photographer of all of these pictures here. In this particular picture, we're looking at a standoff between an officer of the Harrisburg City Police Department and a young black man who had actually spoke at the rally earlier. Something you'll see as a theme throughout these pictures is that the police and the protesters seem to be crossing paths quite often, and that's actually not normal when you see like a planned protest ahead of time, something that had even like city permits. You don't see police like obstructing the path of the protest just to avoid any type of tensions. But this is something that you saw at this particular protest, and I think it's one of the leading reasons why this protest actually ended up turning left. And I'll explain that as we go forward. But this was a planned protest. This is something that was planned days in ahead. The city had advance notice, and that's why you see these officers present here. This wasn't just them responding to a bunch of people that came out and started going crazy that day. I mean, it was an entire rally, um, community leaders and speakers just showing up and talking and sharing their outrage and what they wanted as a plan forward. They were even appealing to some of the city's leaders in the police department. And the police were not present at the rally in particular, but as the march started after the rally, there was a march and a route. The police were very present along that route and in the middle of the planned route. And I think that's what caused some of this tension. You see people sticking up their middle fingers here at these cops because the tension was already high. This is in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd. And so this protest in particular was very, I guess the word would be diverse. You had all ages. You had white, black, Latinx, API, PA. Like you had just a large representation of folks there. And one thing in particular about this picture that I remember, and some of these pictures I may not remember the full story. We're almost closing in on a year now. This was when this happened, but I remember in this picture there's a young um, black man off to the side here with his mask down and the glasses, and then the officer to the left with the white lady in between. They had been going back and forth. The young black man wanted to confront him and ask him questions about why he wears that thin blue line mask that you see him wearing, because they stick together and take up for each other when these kinds of things happen. And I think there's a few people that could argue that the George Floyd incident was justified, but this officer was not very receptive to this young black man. And actually, later on that day, I saw this young black man get pepper sprayed, and he had been peaceful the entire time I saw him, though he had confronted the officers and asked them, challenged them on their views. I never saw him becoming violent or aggressive in any way. And we see the progression of this whole thing going down. I mean, like I said, these officers were directly in the path of the protest. And so as people were coming down this marching route, people weren't burning anything. They weren't throwing anything. They weren't being aggressive or violent with the officers. But when you have a group of people who are already angry, they're upset with the establishment, they're upset with the policing in this country, and they're sick and tired of seeing black men and women abused by the system. And then you place the people that they're mad at in the middle of their paths while they're mad, while the tensions are still high, while the coal is still burning. And I think it's a recipe for disaster. And these officers weren't showing up in good faith. They were there and riot gear, guns out already before things took a turn. And things did take a turn for the worse, but I think that the officers' presence in itself contributed heavily, and I don't think that things would have taken that turn without the officers' presence. I think if they would have just sat along the side of the route and had a minimal presence where they weren't sitting there with their guns out and riot gear on, then there might not have been an actual riot. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You show up in riot gear, and then people are already mad at you, and you create a higher level of tension than there needed to be. This picture is actually one of my favorites right here. Um, It's amazing because here you have people taking the streets, um, angry, frustrated, uh, just completely devastated by what has been happening in this country for a long time and what happened in particular to George Floyd. And you have this, what appears I can't. I'm only presuming their race and ethnicity here, but it's safe to say this is a white family. And regardless of their race, it's a family who chose to have a picnic in the middle of all of this going on. You have people marching past, people marching for their rights, marching for their right to be alive and safe and comfortable in their own community. Um, and this family is having a picnic. I mean, literally just relaxing in the center of all of this going on. How? Is there no outrage? Is there? And I think that how do you do that? How do you not join your neighbors? Your community is hurting, and you're having a picnic. It's um, the most apathetic thing that I could think of in any given moment. Um, and it just really like encompasses the divide that we saw deepen in this country over the last few years. You got people who are literally crying, begging for protection and for safety, and then you have some people who are just going about their regular routine and turning a blind eye to it. Moving on to this next picture here. Um, so if you see in the front there, the commanding officer um, is that black gentleman right in the front. And I wanted to help everyone there. I wanted to help make sure that this didn't become a situation where people were getting shot, arrested. Let me take a step back. When I say help everyone, I mean help people that were members of the community. I had no interest in helping the police. But I tried to tell this commanding officer, you need to fall back. I mean, look at this. This is the state capitol right here. They're talking about the state capitol, the steps. Well, this is a public building. This is a building paid for by the people, for the people. And they created a line here. They drew essentially a line in the sand and said, you will not pass here. There's no reason for this. There was no credible reason to think that the Capitol would be raided, as we saw on January 6th. There was no reason to think that people would be destroying government property. That hadn't happened up until that point, and it didn't happen after that until January 6th. And so they created this line in the sand. I tried to communicate to this commanding officer that his very presence and the bad faith that they were showing by showing up in this riot gear when there had been no violence up until this point, it created a atmosphere of tension. It created that atmosphere that people were feeling like, with everything going on, they had had enough. And this show of force here was not well received. At this point is when things became very, very tense. And as you can see in this picture right here that I took, you see people going face to face with these officers who created this line that didn't need to be created. There was no reason. I mean, like, what are they protecting here? You have to really think about like why this type of line would be created. What are they protecting? There had been no violence. There had been no aggression. There had been absolutely no credible threats to the Capitol, which is what they're in front of. So why create this line? It's a show of force because this is a protest that they wanted to quell. That's what it really was. It was a protest that they wanted to stop. It was a protest that they didn't agree with. And so they drew that line to show force because they wanted to put these people back into their places. And as you see here, you got white, black, old, young. You got, it's hard to tell in this picture. There's probably a couple hundred people um, there at this point, and it does start to trickle down. I think the tension for some people was very uncomfortable, and you have to think you got all these. You just saw what happened to George Floyd um, a week or so beforehand, a couple days beforehand, and then you got all these officers who look eager and willing to become violent, to become aggressive, to take your life, to take your freedom. I don't blame anyone who left at this point because it was very, very tense. And I mean, you could, I just felt like a standoff. Um, when we read about like the Revolutionary War and all these battles that they have when they have these standoffs, this is the closest thing to that that I feel like a lot of people will ever experience. I mean, it was really just a clash of, um, the authorities that be, versus the people that don't recognize their power and don't recognize the legitimacy of their presence in this moment. And you can see here just how heavy, and how overzealous, this method was from the police. Right here in the front, you have, and I don't know if you can see it, but at the bottom right center corner, that officer is holding a rifle. Um, he's holding a weapon that can easily clear a crowd in a fast amount of time. Um, and you telling me that people who are peacefully protesting, people who are trying to stand up for their own freedoms, safeties, and protections, you're telling me that by showing that level of force, and by showing that level of bad faith when there had been no reason to have that type of presence, you're telling me that won't create more tension? That's terrible, terrible policing. And the tensions were high the entire day because of police. Like I said, I'm reiterating this point. I hope it uh, explains what happened this day. But the tensions were just completely um, escalated because the police would not stay out of the path of people who were already mad at the police. Sometimes uh, police should not express, should use what's called professional discretion, where you may have the authority or power to do something. They may have had the authority or power to be in this path, but was it the best thing for lowering an already simmering or boiling pot of tension? Was it the best thing? Was it the best thing for the community long term? Did they create more trust from a community that already lacked trust? Did they make a situation better in a situation that was already not good? No, it made it worse. And you can see here, people took their presence as intimidation. When you see people looking into these officers' eyes, there's a couple pictures like this one here. When you see these people look into these officers' eyes, it's almost as if they're saying, "I'm not scared of you, and you will not trample on my rights or my neighbor's rights." And that's the theme of all the tension that existed that day. And so every time one of these officers showed up in this way, showed up in a way that was forceful or authoritative, it was met this way almost every time. And that's what contributed to the events of that day. Later on in this day, it would be going to become very violent, and aggressive from both sides. It started, from officers pushing and shoving protesters who started to approach that line, and protesters started throwing rocks and bottles, and it escalated. People were getting shot with pepper balls, pepper spray. Officers got hit in the head with bricks. It was just a terrible, um, scary event, that shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have to go in the streets and fight for our neighbors' rights to live peacefully and free. But when we see things like what happened on that day, you know, um, we see that these officers are largely, um, going to stand by each other. They're going to stand by each other, and they're not going to back off when it comes to black and brown people's rights being protected. They don't care about that. But I hope you all enjoyed this content. Make sure to like, share, subscribe. If I should do more things like this, let me know.